I'm Sarah Martinez, 32, and today I run the largest food rescue operation in North America, but at 7 years old, I was the little girl my mother sent into corner stores with instructions to slip candy bars into my backpack. Just pretend you're looking at toys, she'd say, her voice breaking as she watched from outside, too proud to apply for food stamps but too desperate to watch me go to bed hungry again. I remember the exact moment I got caught, the store owner's kind eyes as he knelt down and whispered, "Tell your mama I have day-old bread she can have for free." That act of grace planted a seed that would grow into something extraordinary. 25 years later, my organization has redirected 50 million pounds of food from waste to tables, and every meal served carries the memory of that hungry 7-year-old who promised herself no child would ever have to steal to eat. Hit subscribe if you believe shame can be transformed into purpose. To understand how I became who I am today, you need to know about those years when hunger was our constant companion. My father left when I was 5, walking out with nothing but a suitcase and promises he'd send money that never came. I still remember watching him drive away in that rusted blue pickup truck, my mother's hand trembling on my shoulder as she whispered, "It's just us now, Mija." Mom worked 3 jobs trying to keep us afloat, cleaning offices at dawn, stocking shelves at the grocery store during the day, and waitressing at a diner until midnight. I'd watch her collapse into bed at 2 a.m., only to wake up 4 hours later to start all over again. Her hands were always cracked and bleeding from the industrial cleaning chemicals, but she never complained. Pride was all we had left. Our apartment was a cramped 2-bedroom in the worst part of town, where gunshots mixed with sirens every night. The walls were thin enough that I could hear Mrs. Garcia next door crying over her own bills, and the Martinez family upstairs arguing about money in rapid Spanish. We weren't alone in our struggle, but that didn't make it easier. The worst part wasn't the empty refrigerator or the overdue rent notices taped to our door. It was watching my mother's spirit slowly crumble under the weight of trying to provide for us both. She'd stand in front of our open refrigerator, which contained maybe a half-empty jar of peanut butter and some wilted lettuce, and I'd see her shoulders shake as she tried to figure out what to feed me for dinner. "We're having a creative meal tonight," she'd say with forced cheerfulness, mixing that peanut butter with hot water to make what she called protein soup. I pretended it was delicious because I could see the shame in her eyes every time she served it. There were nights when she'd give me her entire portion, claiming she'd eaten at work. I was too young to understand then that the diner probably didn't feed their employees, and that she was literally starving herself to keep me alive. When I think about sacrifice now, I think about my mother's hollow cheeks and the way her clothes hung loose on her shrinking frame. The government assistant's office was 3 bus rides away, and I remember going with her once when I was 6. We sat in those plastic chairs for 4 hours, surrounded by other families who looked just like us, tired, desperate, holding on to their dignity by threads. Mom filled out form after form, her hand shaking as she wrote down our pathetic financial information, but when our number was finally called, she stood up, grabbed my hand, and walked right out. I asked her why we were leaving, and she said, "Some bridges you can't uncross, Sarah. Once you take that help, people look at you different." That yellowed food stamp application stayed in her jewelry box for years, filled out but never submitted. I found it after she died, a testament to the pride that both saved and starved us. She'd rather send her 7-year-old daughter to steal candy bars than admit to the government that she couldn't provide. Looking back, I understand her choice, even if I disagree with it. She was trying to protect what little dignity we had left, trying to shield me from the stigma she knew would follow us. But what she couldn't see was that hunger has its own stigma, its own shame that follows you long after your belly is full. Rodriguez's Corner Market became my second home during those hungry years, though not for the reasons you might expect. After that first day when Mr. Rodriguez caught me trying to steal and offered us free bread instead, something fundamental shifted in how I understood the world. Mr. Rodriguez was a small man with kind eyes and calloused hands who'd immigrated from El Salvador 20 years earlier. His store was cramped, with narrow aisles and fluorescent lights that flickered, but it was clean and organized with the care of someone who understood that this business was his family's lifeline. Behind the counter, taped to the wall, was a faded business card that read, "Miguel Rodriguez, proprietor," in simple black letters, the same card he pressed into my mother's hand that first day, the one I still carry in my wallet today. "Your mama, she's a good woman," he told me in his accented English as he bagged up day-old bread and bruised fruit. "Sometimes good people need help, and sometimes we need to let them help us back." I didn't understand what he meant then, but he was teaching me my first lesson about dignity in poverty. Mr. Rodriguez had a system. Every evening at closing time, he'd set aside items that were approaching their expiration dates, bread that would be stale by morning, produce with soft spots, dented cans that he couldn't sell at full price. Instead of throwing them away, He'd bag them up and leave them by the back door with a simple note, "For families who need." I learned his schedule and would arrive just as he was locking up. He never made me feel like charity. Instead, he'd hand me the bags and say, "Tell your mama these are for helping me clean up. Can't have food going to waste." It was a beautiful lie that preserved my mother's pride while filling our empty refrigerator, but Mr. Rodriguez was teaching me something bigger than just how to manage hunger. He showed me how other families in our neighborhood were struggling too. There was Mrs. Chen with her 3 children, whose husband had been injured at the factory. The Wilson family, where the father had been laid off from the plant. Old Mr. Patterson, living on Social Security that barely covered his medications, let alone groceries. Poverty isn't personal, Mr. Rodriguez would tell me as we watched these families come and go from his store. It's not because people are lazy or bad. Sometimes life just hits hard, and we all need community to survive. I'd see how he'd quietly slip extra items into bags, how he'd accept partial payments with a smile, how he'd extend credit to families he knew were good for it. He ran his business with both his head and his heart, understanding that keeping his community fed was more important than maximizing profit. The most important lesson came when I was 8, and I witnessed him catch another child stealing a boy about my age trying to slip a candy bar into his jacket. Instead of calling the police or shaming the child, Mr. Rodriguez knelt down to his level, just as he had with me, and said, "Why don't you help me sweep the floor, and we'll call it even." That's when I understood that Mr. Rodriguez wasn't just running a corner store. He was creating a safety net for our entire neighborhood, one small act of kindness at a time. He was showing me that businesses could be more than profit centers, they could be lifelines for communities that the larger world had forgotten. Years later, when I was developing my first business plan for food rescue, I thought about Mr. Rodriguez's backdoor system. How he turned waste into hope, how he preserved dignity while meeting needs, how he built community through quiet generosity. Every principle that guides my organization today was born in that cramped corner store, watching a kind man prove that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to let your neighbors go hungry. School was supposed to be my escape from the hunger at home, but it became another battlefield where I had to hide our family's reality. Every morning, I'd walk through those doors with my head held high, pretending I was just like every other kid, when the truth was I hadn't eaten since the day before. The free lunch program was available. I qualified easily based on our income, but accepting it meant admitting poverty in front of my classmates. The lunch ladies would call out names from their list, and every kid in line would know exactly who couldn't afford to pay. I couldn't bear the thought of that public shame, so I kept that faded lunch ticket hidden in my backpack, and used and growing more wrinkled each day. Instead, I became a master of deception. I forgot my lunch money. I'd tell the cafeteria workers, shrugging like it was no big deal. "I'll just wait until I get home." Then I'd spend lunch period in the library, pretending to study while my stomach growled so loudly I was afraid other students would hear. Mrs. Patterson, my 3rd grade teacher, was the first to notice. She was a soft-spoken woman with gray hair and eagle eyes who seemed to see everything that happened in her classroom. One day, after I declined yet another lunch invitation from a classmate, she asked me to stay after class. "Sarah, honey, are you feeling all right? You seem tired lately," she said, her voice gentle but concerned. I mumbled something about staying up late reading, but she wasn't fooled. The next day, she started a new classroom tradition: afternoon snacks for everyone. "Growing brains need fuel," she'd announce, pulling out crackers and juice boxes that she obviously bought with her own money. She never singled me out, never made it obvious that those snacks were specifically for the kids she knew weren't eating enough. But she always made sure I got extra, slipping me a second package of crackers with a conspiratorial wink. "You're such a good helper, Sarah. Take this home for later." The irony wasn't lost on me that I was excelling academically while literally starving. Hunger sharpened my focus in strange ways. I threw myself into schoolwork with an intensity that impressed my teachers but worried my classmates. While other kids were playing at recess, I was in the library, reading voraciously, as if knowledge could fill the empty space in my stomach. My grades were perfect, my behavior exemplary, but I lived in constant fear that someone would discover our secret. When classmates invited me to birthday parties, I'd make excuses. When school fundraisers required parent participation, I'd forge my mother's signature rather than admit she was working 3 jobs and couldn't attend. Every school event became a minefield of potential exposure. The worst moments came during classroom discussions about family traditions or holiday meals. While other kids talked about their mother's cooking or family dinners, I'd sit silently, having nothing to contribute. What could I say? That our family tradition was creative rationing? That our holiday meals were whatever Mr. Rodriguez had set aside that week, but hunger taught me things my well-fed classmates couldn't learn. It taught me to be grateful for small things, to notice when others were struggling, to never waste anything. When kids threw away half-eaten sandwiches, it physically hurt me to watch. I started carrying those discarded lunches home, telling myself they were for later but knowing they were often my only real meal of the day. One day in fourth grade, a new student named Maria started school mid-semester. She was quiet, withdrawn, and I recognized something familiar in her eyes, the hollow look of hunger. When she declined lunch invitation after lunch invitation, I knew she was living my same secret. That afternoon, I did something that surprised even me. I approached her with one of Mrs. Patterson's extra snack packages and said, simply, "I get too full to eat all of this. Want to help me?" She looked at me with such gratitude that I nearly cried. That moment taught me that sometimes the best way to help yourself is to help someone else. Maria and I became allies in our shared secret, looking out for each other in ways that preserved both our dignity and our friendship. We were the kids who always had forgotten lunches, who always had too much snack to finish alone, who understood that hunger was something you survived together. High school changed everything for me, though not in ways I could have predicted. Despite the hunger, despite the constant worry about bills and eviction notices, I threw myself into academics with the desperation of someone who knew education was my only way out. My grades were flawless, my SAT scores in the 99th percentile, and my teachers started using words like potential and scholarship when they talked about my future. The guidance counselor, Ms. Rodriguez, no relation to my corner store angel, but equally important in my story, called me into her office during senior year with a stack of college applications. "Sarah, you have options," she said, spreading brochures across her desk like tarot cards revealing possible futures. Full-ride scholarships. Top universities. You could study anything you want. Anything I wanted. The phrase was foreign to me. My entire life had been about survival, about making do, about wanting things I couldn't have. The idea that I could choose my path, that doors were opening instead of closing, was overwhelming. I applied to 12 schools, each application fee waived due to our financial situation. Mom helped me fill out the FAFSA forms, both of us amazed by how little money we actually had when it was written down in black and white. Our entire annual income was less than what some of my classmates' families spent on vacation. The first acceptance letter came from State University with a partial scholarship. Then another from community college with full tuition coverage. Each letter felt like validation, proof that the hunger and sacrifice meant something. But it was the envelope. From State University, thick, official, with my name typed in bold letters, that changed everything. Full academic scholarship, I read aloud to my mother, my voice shaking. Tuition, room, board, books, and a monthly stipend for living expenses. 4 years of education, fully paid, plus money for food and necessities. I read it 3 times. Before the words sank in. My mother cried. Not the quiet tears I'd seen her shed over unpaid bills, but deep, body-shaking sobs of relief and pride. "You did it, Mija," she whispered, holding that letter like it was made of gold. "You're going to have a life I could never give you." But accepting meant leaving her alone. I was her only family, her primary source of emotional support, and the guilt of abandoning her to chase my dreams felt overwhelming. "What if something happens to you while I'm gone?" I asked. "What if you get sick? What if you lose one of your jobs?" She took my face in her hands, those same cracked and bleeding hands that had worked so hard to keep us alive, and said something I'll never forget. "Sarah, you are not responsible for my choices or my life. You are responsible for becoming the person you're meant to be. I didn't sacrifice everything just to watch you sacrifice your future for me." The scholarship letter now hangs framed in my office, but back then, it was our ticket to hope. For the first time in my life, we could imagine a future where hunger wasn't the main character in our story. Where my mother could work 1 job instead of 3. Where I could eat in cafeterias without shame. Telling Mr. Rodriguez about the scholarship was almost as emotional as telling my mother. He beamed with pride, as if my success was somehow his success too. "You see," he said, patting my shoulder with his gentle hands. "Good things come to people who don't give up. You're going to help a lot of people someday, Sarah. I can see it. In your eyes." He was right, though I didn't know it then. That scholarship wasn't just changing my life, it was setting me on a path toward changing thousands of others. Every meal I'd serve, every family I'd help, every policy I'd influence, it all started with that thick envelope and the impossible dream it contained. Senior year became a countdown to freedom, but also a time of intense preparation. I worked part-time at a local restaurant to save money for college expenses, finally understanding what it meant to earn money for things I wanted rather than just things I needed. The transition from survival mode to planning mode was jarring but exhilarating. Graduation day, I walked across that stage knowing I was the first person in my family to finish high school, let alone go to college. My mother sat in the audience, wearing the only dress she owned, crying with pride. Mr. Rodriguez was there too, giving me a thumbs up from the back row. That night, as I packed my few belongings for college, I made a promise to myself and to everyone who had helped me reach this moment. I would not just succeed, I would find a way to lift others as I climbed. The hunger that had defined my childhood would become the fuel for my purpose. Walking onto State University's campus that first day felt like entering another world. Students rushed past carrying textbooks that cost more than my mother made in a week, talking casually about spring break trips to Cancun and summer internships. In Europe, the dining hall served food until 10 p.m., and students complained when the soft-serve ice cream machine was broken. I stood there marveling at the abundance, remembering nights when ice cubes were our dinner. My dorm room was a luxury I'd never imagined: a bed that was mine alone, a desk, a closet, and access to unlimited hot water. My roommate, Jessica, was a sweet girl from suburban Dallas whose biggest worry was whether her boyfriend from high school would stay faithful. She unpacked boxes of clothes, electronics, and snacks that her parents had loaded into their SUV, chattering about how totally excited she was to finally be independent. I unpacked my single suitcase in 10 minutes. Everything I owned fit in half a dresser drawer. The campus dining hall was my first real culture shock. Students filled trays with more food than my family would see in a week, then threw away half-eaten portions without a second thought. Watching them scrape plates into garbage cans made my stomach turn. I started eating at the tables closest to the dish return, quietly collecting discarded fruit and wrapped items that looked untouched. "What are you doing?" Jessica asked one day, catching me slipping an abandoned apple into my backpack. "Just cleaning up," I mumbled, but she looked at me strangely. It took weeks to adjust to the idea that I could eat whenever I was hungry. The dining hall was open 14 hours a day, and my meal plan covered everything. But years of scarcity had trained my body to hoard, to save, to never trust that the next meal was guaranteed. I found myself eating past fullness and hiding snacks in my room, just in case. Everything changed when I discovered the campus food bank during my second month. I was walking past the student center when I saw a small sign, "Student Food Pantry, no questions asked." Curious, I followed the arrow downstairs to a basement room lined with shelves of canned goods, boxes of pasta, and bins of fresh produce. "First time?" asked a student volunteer named Marcus, a junior with kind eyes and a warm smile. I nodded, suddenly embarrassed. "Hey, no shame here. About 30% of college students experience food insecurity at some point. You'd be amazed how many people use this place." 30%. I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only one struggling with the transition from poverty to plenty, the only one whose scholarship didn't quite cover everything, the only one who understood the difference between hungry and starving. Marcus handed me a volunteer information sheet. "We're always looking for help, especially people who understand what this service means. Interested?" That orange volunteer badge became my lifeline to purpose. Working at the food bank connected me to my past while building toward my future. I met students from every background imaginable: kids whose parents had been laid off, international students whose families couldn't send money, graduate students choosing between textbooks and groceries, but it also connected me to staff members who became mentors. Dr. Patricia Williams, the faculty advisor, was a social work professor who'd grown up in foster care. She saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself yet. "You have an intuitive understanding of systems," she told me after watching me reorganize the pantry's distribution process to serve twice as many students in half the time. "Have you considered social work? Or maybe business with a nonprofit focus?" I'd been planning to study computer science. It seemed practical, lucrative, a guaranteed way out of poverty. But Dr. Williams introduced me to concepts I'd never heard of: food justice, systemic inequality, social entrepreneurship. She loaned me books about people who'd turned their personal struggles into platforms for change. The more I learned, the more I realized that my childhood hadn't just been about surviving hunger, it had been about witnessing an entire system that failed families like mine. The food stamp application my mother never submitted wasn't just about pride, it was about a program designed to feel humiliating. Mr. Rodriguez's kindness wasn't just individual generosity. It was filling gaps that shouldn't exist in the wealthiest country in the world. By my sophomore year, I was leading campus food security initiatives, organizing "Waste Not" campaigns to redirect dining hall surplus to the food pantry, and studying everything I could about food systems and social innovation. My grades remained perfect, but now I had direction beyond just academic success. The statistics I learned were staggering. America threw away 40% of its food while 1 in 8 people experienced hunger. Perfectly good produce was discarded for cosmetic imperfections. Restaurants trashed meals because of liability fears. Meanwhile, families like mine went without. Jessica graduated to become my closest friend once she understood my background. She started volunteering at the food bank, too, and helped me navigate campus social life with patience and genuine care. "You're going to change the world, Sarah," she'd tell me when I felt overwhelmed by the scope of the problems I wanted to solve. I was beginning to believe she might be right. That orange volunteer badge represented more than just service hours. It was my first real glimpse of how personal pain could be transformed into public purpose. Every student I helped, every system I improved, every waste stream I redirected was practice for something bigger that I couldn't yet fully envision. The hunger that had once been my greatest source of shame was becoming my greatest source of strength. Senior year brought the pressure of choosing a capstone project that would define my academic legacy. While my classmates stressed about topics like social media's impact on teen self-esteem or urban planning in small cities, I knew exactly what I wanted to tackle: the massive disconnect between food waste and food insecurity in America. Dr. Williams had become my unofficial advisor, and she encouraged me to think big. "Don't just write a paper, Sarah. Create something that could actually exist in the real world." So I did something that terrified and excited me in equal measure. I decided to write a comprehensive business plan for a food rescue organization. I spent 3 months researching everything I could find about food recovery, studying existing models like City Harvest in New York and Food Forward in Los Angeles. I analyzed their successes and limitations, trying to understand why food rescue hadn't scaled to every major city in America. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that the missing piece wasn't just logistics. It was a sustainable business model that could attract investment and replicate across markets. My original business plan was handwritten in a composition notebook I'd bought for $2 at the campus bookstore. Coffee-stained and filled with crossed-out sections, arrows pointing to margin notes, and pages taped in when I ran out of space. It was a mess. But it was also the most important document I'd ever created. The concept was elegantly simple: create a technology-enabled platform that connected food donors with hunger relief organizations, reducing waste while feeding communities. Restaurants, grocery stores, and caterers would use an app to alert us when they had surplus food. Our drivers would collect it within hours and distribute it to food banks, shelters, and community organizations that served families in need. But the innovation was in the details. Unlike existing food rescue operations that relied entirely on volunteers and donations, my model included revenue streams that could make the organization financially sustainable. We'd charge modest fees to large corporate donors who wanted the tax benefits and positive PR of food donation. We'd offer consulting services to help businesses optimize their ordering to reduce waste. We'd sell anonymized data about food waste patterns to help cities and organizations make better policy decisions. Most importantly, we'd hire from the communities we served. Every driver, every warehouse worker, every customer service representative would be someone who understood hunger personally, turning the organization into an engine for economic mobility as well as food access. I worked on that business plan obsessively, spending entire weekends in the library, missing social events, and driving Jessica crazy with my constant talk about scalable impact models and cross-sector partnerships. But I couldn't stop. This felt bigger than an academic assignment. It felt like a blueprint for my life's work. The financial projections were the hardest part. I had to teach myself about cash flow statements, revenue modeling, and investor presentations using YouTube videos and library books. I projected that we could serve 5,000 people daily within our first year, growing to 50,000 daily by year 5, while generating enough revenue to become self-sustaining. My professor, Dr. Martinez, was skeptical during our midterm review. "These numbers seem optimistic, Sarah. Food rescue is notoriously difficult to monetize. What makes you think you can succeed where others have struggled?" I looked at him across his cluttered desk, thinking about 7-year-old me stealing candy bars, about Mr. Rodriguez's backdoor kindness, about the 30% of college students who couldn't afford consistent meals. "Because I'm not just trying to solve hunger, Professor. I'm trying to solve the systems that create hunger in the first place." The presentation day arrived in December, and I was terrified. 20 minutes to present 4 months of work to a panel of professors and local business leaders who would judge whether my dream was viable or naive. I wore my only professional outfit, a blazer Jessica had helped me find at Goodwill, and carried that coffee-stained notebook like it contained the secrets of the universe. I started with the statistics that had driven me to this moment: 40% food waste, 54 million Americans food insecure, 13 million children going to bed hungry. Then I told my story, the hungry 7-year-old who became a college senior determined to ensure no other child would face the same choice between pride and starvation. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then Dr. Sandra Chen, a local venture capitalist who served on the panel, raised her hand. Sarah, this is the most compelling social venture pitch I've heard in years. The combination of lived experience, thorough research, and innovative thinking is exactly what investors look for. Have you considered actually launching this? The question hit me like lightning. Actually launching this? Taking this coffee-stained dream and turning it into reality. I've thought about little else for 4 months, I admitted. But I don't know the first thing about starting a real organization. Dr. Chen smiled. That's what mentors are for. I'd like to talk with you about next steps. 3 weeks later, I received news that my business plan had won the university's social innovation competition, earning $10,000 in seed funding and access to the Entrepreneur in Residence program. But more importantly, it had attracted the attention of people who could help me turn this academic exercise into actual impact. That night, I called my mother to tell her about the win. Mija, she said, her voice thick with emotion, I always knew that hungry little girl would grow up to feed the world. Looking at that original business plan now, with its amateur formatting and optimistic projections, I'm amazed by how much of it became reality. But what I treasure most are the coffee stains and margin notes, the physical evidence of those late nights when I first dared to believe that my pain could become someone else's solution. Graduation day felt like stepping off a cliff into an uncertain future. While my classmates celebrated job offers from Fortune 500 companies and graduate school acceptances, I faced a choice that would define the rest of my life: pursue financial security or chase my impossible dream of ending hunger in America. The job market in 2015 was brutal for new graduates, even those with perfect GPAs and compelling personal stories. I sent out dozens of applications to nonprofit organizations, hoping to find work that aligned with my values while I developed my food rescue concept on the side. The responses were consistently disappointing. We appreciate your passion, but we're looking for someone with more experience, or budget constraints prevent us from hiring entry-level positions. Meanwhile, corporate recruiters were calling daily. Tech companies, consulting firms, financial services, everyone wanted the scholarship kid with the inspiring backstory and the spotless academic record. The salary offers were staggering too. Someone who'd grown up counting pennies. 6 figures plus benefits, signing bonuses, stock options. Everything my mother and I had dreamed about during those hungry years. I took a position with Morrison Consulting, a mid-sized firm in downtown Austin, telling myself it was temporary. Just long enough to build some savings, pay off my mother's debts, and gain the professional experience that would make my nonprofit more credible to future funders. The steady paycheck felt like winning the lottery after years of financial anxiety, but corporate life nearly crushed my soul. My days were consumed by PowerPoint presentations about optimizing supply chains for companies that threw away more food in a week than my neighborhood ate in a month. I sat in glass conference rooms discussing efficiency metrics, while remembering Mr. Rodriguez carefully rationing day-old bread to families who needed it. The irony was suffocating. I was making more money than anyone in my family had ever made. But I felt poorer than I had while stealing candy bars as a 7-year-old. At least then, I had known who I was and what I stood for. Every evening after work, I'd return to my small apartment and work on my food rescue plan. Refining the business model, researching potential partnerships, reaching out to restaurant owners and food bank directors. The coffee-stained notebook from college had evolved into detailed spreadsheets and professional presentations, but the foundation remained the same. The rejection letters started arriving within weeks of my first funding applications. Thank you for your innovative proposal, but we're not accepting unsolicited business plans at this time. While your personal story is compelling, we require 3 years of operational history before considering investment. Your projections seem unrealistic for an organization with no track record. Each rejection felt personal, like a judgment. Not just on my business plan but on my worthiness to solve problems I'd lived through. The form letters were especially cruel, their polite language barely masking the message: come back when you're more qualified to address your own trauma. The lowest point came 6 months after graduation, when the Austin Food Bank, the organization I'd volunteered with throughout college, declined my proposal for a pilot partnership. Sarah, we appreciate your enthusiasm, the director told me during a brief phone call, but we've worked with many well-intentioned young people who think they can revolutionize our sector. Food rescue is more complicated than it looks from the outside. More complicated than it looks from the outside. As if I'd been observing hunger through a telescope rather than living it in my kitchen. That night, I seriously considered abandoning the project entirely. My mother was finally stable financially thanks to my regular contributions to her expenses. I was building a respectable resume and a healthy savings account. Maybe it was time to accept that some dreams were meant to stay. Dreams, but something Mr. Rodriguez had told me years earlier kept echoing in my mind: good things come to people who don't give up. I realized that every successful social entrepreneur in history had probably faced similar rejection, similar doubt, similar moments of wanting to quit. The difference between dreamers and changemakers wasn't the absence of obstacles, it was the refusal to let obstacles become excuses. I started approaching the problem differently. Instead of seeking permission from established organizations, I began building relationships with individual restaurant owners and small food banks. Instead of asking for large investments, I focused on proving the concept with my own resources. Every weekend, I'd drive around Austin in my used Honda Civic, collecting surplus food from willing donors and delivering it to community centers. The operation was laughably small, maybe 50 meals rescued per week, but it was real. Real food reaching real families. Real proof that my model could work, even at the smallest scale. I kept meticulous records of every pickup and delivery, every dollar saved by donors, every family served. Those early rejection letters taught me a valuable lesson about persistence and validation. People would doubt my age, my experience, my credentials. But they couldn't argue with results. Every meal rescued, every partnership formed, every family fed was another piece of evidence that this hungry kid from the corner of nowhere might actually know what she was talking about. The corporate job that had felt like selling my soul gradually became my advantage. I was learning about operations, finance, and management, skills that would prove essential when my food rescue organization finally took off. I was building credibility and professional networks that would open doors my college-aged self never could have accessed. Most importantly, I was learning that sometimes the path to your purpose isn't a straight line. Sometimes you have to walk through corporate conference rooms to understand how to change the systems that create hunger. Sometimes you have to face rejection to appreciate the value of persistence. Sometimes you have to feel lost to remember why you started walking in the first place. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected place, a chance encounter at a coffee shop on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. I was grabbing my usual black coffee before work when I overheard the man in front of me arguing with the barista about throwing away day-old pastries. "This is criminal," he was saying in accented English, gesturing at a tray of perfectly good croissants and muffins destined for the dumpster. "In my country, we would never waste food like this. There are hungry people everywhere, and you throw away bread." Something about his passion reminded me of Mr. Rodriguez, and I found myself stepping forward. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing. I run a small food rescue operation. Would you be interested in donating those items instead of throwing them away?" The man turned to look at me, mid-50s, tired eyes, calloused hands that spoke of years in restaurant kitchens. "You rescue food? How does this work?" That conversation changed everything. His name was Antonio Morales, and he owned Esperanza, a small Mexican restaurant struggling to stay afloat in Austin's competitive food scene. Like many small business owners, he hated the waste but didn't know what to do with surplus food at the end of each day. "Health department says we cannot serve day-old food," he explained as we sat at a corner table. "Insurance company says we cannot give it away because of liability. So every night, I throw away enough food to feed 20 families, and it breaks my heart." I pulled out my phone and showed him photos from my weekend food rescue runs, smiling families receiving fresh meals, volunteers loading cars with rescued groceries, before and after shots of food that would have been wasted. What if I told you there are legal protections for food donors? What if I handled all the pickup and delivery? What if you could eliminate waste while helping your community? Antonio studied the photos with growing interest. "You do this for free?" "I do this because I remember being hungry," I said simply. "When I was 7 years old, my mother sent me to steal food because we couldn't afford to eat. A kind store owner helped us instead of calling the police, and that changed my life. Now I want to help other families the same way." Something in my story resonated with him. Antonio had immigrated from Mexico 15 years earlier, working double shifts to save enough money to open his own restaurant. He understood hunger, struggle, and the power of second chances. "Okay," he said, extending his hand across the table. "Let's try this. But I want to see how it works first." That handshake, captured in a blurry photo by another coffee shop customer who offered to document the moment, became the foundation of everything that followed. It wasn't a legal contract or a formal agreement, just two people who understood hunger deciding to do something about it. Our first pickup was scheduled for the following Friday night. I arrived at Esperanza at closing time, nervous about whether Antonio would follow through. But there he was, waiting by the back door with 3 large containers of food, leftover carnitas, rice and beans that were perfectly fresh but couldn't be served the next day, and tortillas that had been made that morning. "This feeds maybe 30 people," he said, helping me load the containers into my Honda Civic. "Where does it go?" I drove him to the Austin Community Center, where families gathered every Friday for a free dinner program that was chronically underfunded. The coordinator, Maria Santos, nearly cried when she saw how much food we'd brought. "We were going to serve peanut butter sandwiches tonight because we ran out of money for groceries," she said, looking at the feast we'd delivered. "This is going to make 30 families very happy." Antonio watched as families lined up for dinner, saw children's faces light up when they realized there was enough food for seconds, witnessed parents' relief at being able to feed their families a nutritious meal. When an elderly grandfather approached him to say gracias, with tears in his eyes, Antonio had to step outside to compose himself. "This is why I came to America," he told me as we drove back to his restaurant. "To help people, to build something good. Thank you for showing me how." Within a week, Antonio was calling other restaurant owners, telling them about our partnership. "There's this young woman," he'd say, "who takes our extra food and feeds families. No paperwork, no hassle, just good food going to good people instead of garbage." His enthusiasm was infectious. By the end of October, we had 3 more restaurants participating. By November, we were rescuing over 200 meals per week. By December, local food banks were calling me to ask if we could expand to their service areas. The operation was still small, still run entirely out of my personal vehicle during evenings and weekends, but it was growing. More importantly, it was proving that my college business plan could work in the real world. Every successful pickup, every delivered meal, every grateful family was evidence that food rescue could scale beyond academic theory. Antonio became more than my first partner, he became my first real advocate. He introduced me to other business owners, vouched for my credibility, and helped me understand the restaurant industry from an owner's perspective. His willingness to take a chance on an unknown recent graduate opened doors that all my perfect presentations couldn't budge. That blurry handshake photo now sits framed in my office, a reminder that sometimes the most important business partnerships begin with the simplest human connections. 2 people who remembered being hungry, deciding to make sure others didn't have to feel the same way. The corporate consulting job that had felt like a prison became my funding source for gas, storage containers, and the small expenses that kept our volunteer operation running. Every boring PowerPoint presentation was subsidizing rescued meals. Every client meeting was one step closer to quitting and pursuing food rescue full-time. But more than anything, that first partnership with Antonio taught me that my childhood experience wasn't a liability to overcome, it was an asset that connected me with people who shared my values. The hunger that had once been my greatest shame was becoming my greatest strength in building a movement. Success brought problems I'd never anticipated. By spring 2016, we were rescuing over 500 meals per week from 8 restaurants, but my evenings and weekends operation was cracking under the pressure. My Honda Civic could barely handle the volume. I was exhausted from working 2 full-time jobs, and the informal systems that worked for 3 restaurants were creating chaos with 8. The wake-up call came on a Tuesday night in March. I'd promised pickup from 4 restaurants between 6 and 9 p.m., plus delivery to 3 different community centers. What should have been a routine evening turned into a logistics nightmare when my car broke down outside the second restaurant, loaded with perishable food and no backup plan, standing in that parking lot at 7:30 p.m., frantically calling friends to help transport food before it spoiled. I realized I'd been so focused on proving my concept that I'd ignored basic operational requirements. Good intentions weren't enough to run a sustainable organization. The situation got worse before it got better. 2 weeks later, the Austin Health Department showed up unannounced at one of our partner restaurants. A competitor had filed a complaint alleging food safety violations in our rescue operation. The inspector was professional but thorough, questioning everything from our transportation methods to our storage procedures. "Ma'am, do you have a food handler's license? What about your volunteers? Where are your temperature logs? How do you ensure food safety during transport?" The questions came rapid fire, and I had answers for none of them. The yellow citation notice, improper food handling procedures, felt like a death sentence for our operation. It wasn't just a regulatory violation, it was proof that my passion-driven approach was endangering the very people I was trying to help. The restaurant owner, understandably panicked about his own license, immediately suspended our partnership. Within 48 hours, 3 other restaurants had pulled out. Word spreads fast in the food industry, and no business owner wanted to risk their license for an uninsured, unlicensed operation run by someone who clearly didn't understand regulatory requirements. I spent the next week in crisis mode, researching food safety regulations, consulting lawyers about liability insurance, and trying to understand why no one had warned me about these requirements. The answer was humbling. Everyone assumed I already knew what I was doing, because I spoke with such confidence about food rescue. My mother, ever practical, put it simply during one of our nightly phone calls: "Mija, you can't help people if you hurt them first." Maybe it's time to learn the rules before you try to change them. She was right, but learning the rules meant admitting how much I didn't know. I enrolled in food safety courses, studied health department regulations, and discovered that proper food rescue required licenses, training, insurance, and documentation that could cost thousands of dollars to implement. The financial reality was sobering. Commercial vehicle insurance for food transport, $3,000 annually. Food handlers' licenses for all volunteers, $200 each. Proper food storage equipment, $5,000 minimum. Legal consultation for liability protection, $150 per hour. My weekend food rescue hobby was going to require the infrastructure of a real business, but the regulatory challenges were nothing compared to the operational chaos. As we'd grown, I'd recruited volunteers haphazardly, college friends, church members, anyone willing to help. Without proper training or coordination, pickup times were missed, delivery schedules conflicted, and communication breakdowns left food sitting too long in unsafe temperatures. Jessica, who'd been volunteering since our college days, finally confronted me about the management issues. Sarah, I love what you're doing, but this is becoming dangerous. Last week, Maria showed up to the same pickup as David, and they both waited an hour because nobody knew who was supposed to be there. We need systems, not just good intentions. The breaking point came when I discovered that one of our volunteers had been taking rescued food home for personal use instead of delivering it to families in need. Not a lot, just some bread and produce, but enough to violate the trust that restaurants had placed in our operation. When confronted, the volunteer was defensive. You never said we couldn't take some. It was going to waste anyway. That conversation forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. I'd been so focused on the vision of feeding hungry families that I'd neglected the unglamorous work of building policies, procedures, and accountability measures. My operation was amateur hour, and the people I was trying to help deserved better. The lowest moment came when Antonio, my first partner and biggest advocate, asked for a private meeting. Sarah, I believe in what you're doing, he said gently. But I can't risk my restaurant's reputation on an operation that doesn't have proper safeguards. You need to get professional help, or I have to stop participating. Losing Antonio felt like losing my father all over again, the person who'd believed in me when no one else would, withdrawing support because I'd failed to meet basic standards of competence. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't run a food rescue organization as a side project while working in corporate consulting. I couldn't wing it with good intentions and volunteer labor. If I was going to do this right, I needed to commit fully and build the professional infrastructure that restaurants and families deserved. I submitted my resignation letter to Morrison Consulting the next morning, giving 2 weeks' notice to pursue entrepreneurial opportunities in the nonprofit sector. My boss was confused. I was on track for promotion and a significant salary increase, but I'd learned that some opportunities cost more than money. The health department citation that had seemed like a disaster became my roadmap for improvement. Every violation listed became a checklist item for building better systems. Every regulatory requirement became a standard to exceed rather than merely meet. 3 months later, when I returned to Antonio with proper insurance, licensed volunteers, food safety protocols, and documented procedures, he welcomed me back with a smile and another handshake. But this time, he was shaking hands with a real organization, not just a passionate college graduate with a dream. That yellow citation notice now hangs in my office next to our first professional license, a reminder that failure isn't the opposite of success, it's often the foundation for it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 2017, 18 months after I'd quit my consulting job to build Hope Kitchen Network into a legitimate organization. I almost threw it away, assuming it was another rejection. The return address read Hamilton Foundation with an Austin postmark, and I didn't remember applying to any foundation by that name. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead with a message that made me read it 3 times before the words sank in. Dear Ms. Martinez, we have been following your work with Hope Kitchen Network and are impressed by your innovative approach to food rescue. We would like to invite you to submit a full proposal for a $1.2 million capacity building grant. $1,200,000. More money than I'd made in my entire life, offered by a foundation I'd never heard of for an organization that was still operating out of my apartment with 3 full-time employees and a fleet of 2 used delivery vans. I called the number immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed. The program officer, Linda Chen, explained that they'd been researching food security organizations across Texas and had been following our growth through local media coverage and word-of-mouth recommendations from restaurant partners. Your model is exactly what we're looking for, she said. Scalable, sustainable, and led by someone with lived experience of the problem you're solving. We're particularly interested in your employment program for people experiencing food insecurity. The employment program she referenced had emerged organically from necessity. When we professionalized our operations, I'd realized that our most effective volunteers were people who understood hunger personally, formerly homeless individuals, single parents struggling to make ends meet, immigrants working multiple jobs to support their families. Instead of relying entirely on volunteer labor, we'd started hiring community members for paid positions as drivers, warehouse assistants, and community liaisons. It wasn't just about filling jobs, it was about creating pathways out of poverty for the same people we served. A revolutionary concept that had started as practical problem solving. Linda explained that the Hamilton Foundation was specifically focused on organizations that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Food banks feed people today, she said, but you're building an organization that could eliminate the need for food banks tomorrow. The proposal process was unlike anything I'd experienced. Instead of a simple application, they wanted a comprehensive strategic plan covering the next 5 years, detailed financial projections, impact measurements, and a roadmap for national expansion. They assigned us a consultant to help develop the proposal. A former McKinsey partner who specialized in social ventures, working with David Park was humbling and transformative. He approached our operation with the same analytical rigor that Fortune 500 companies applied to their strategic planning, identifying strengths I hadn't recognized and weaknesses I'd been ignoring. Your unit economics are better than most for-profit logistics companies, he told me during our third meeting, reviewing spreadsheets I'd created to track every aspect of our operations. You're moving food more efficiently than traditional distribution networks while creating social value that can't be quantified. But he also pushed me to think bigger than I'd ever imagined. Sarah, you're thinking about Hope Kitchen Network as a regional organization that might serve multiple cities. The Hamilton Foundation wants to fund a national model that could be replicated in every major metropolitan area in America. Every major metropolitan area in America. The scope was staggering, but David helped me understand that the foundation saw what I was too close to recognize. We weren't just running a food rescue operation in Austin. We were prototyping a solution to systemic hunger that could transform how America thought about food waste and food security. The proposal we submitted was 127 pages of detailed analysis, financial modeling, and strategic planning. It outlined a 5-year plan to expand Hope Kitchen Network to 15 cities, serving 250,000 people annually while creating 500 permanent jobs for community members. The employment component had evolved from an afterthought to a central feature, a recognition that true food security required economic security. The site visit came 6 weeks later. Linda arrived with 2 other foundation executives for a full day of meetings, facility tours, and interviews with staff, volunteers, restaurant partners, and families we served. I was terrified they'd discover we were still a scrappy startup pretending to be a sophisticated organization, but something magical happened during those interviews. Antonio, my first restaurant partner, spoke passionately about how our partnership had reduced his waste costs while connecting him to his community. Maria, one of our first hired drivers who'd been homeless 18 months earlier, explained how her job had allowed her to secure stable housing and regain custody of her children. Most powerfully, Rosa Gutierrez, a single mother who'd been receiving our rescued meals for 2 years, told the foundation team how consistent access to nutritious food had allowed her to focus on job training instead of daily survival. Before Hope Kitchen, I spent every day worried about feeding my children, she said. Now I spend my days planning our future. The decision came 2 weeks before Christmas. Linda called personally to deliver the news. Sarah, the board voted unanimously to approve your proposal. We're excited to partner with you as you scale this model nationally. I hung up the phone and immediately burst into tears. Not just relief or excitement, but overwhelming gratitude for every person who'd believed in this vision when it was just a coffee-stained notebook and impossible dream. My mother, Mr. Rodriguez, Dr. Williams, Antonio, Jessica, and hundreds of volunteers and partners who'd helped turn an academic exercise into a movement. The check arrived by courier the following week, a piece of paper worth more than my childhood home, representing the foundation's belief that a hungry kid from Austin could help feed America. I photographed it before depositing it, wanting to remember the moment when everything changed, but the money wasn't the real breakthrough. It was the validation that our approach, combining immediate hunger relief with long-term economic empowerment, treating people as partners rather than beneficiaries, building sustainable business models around social justice, could work at scale. That afternoon, I called a staff meeting to share the news and announce our expansion plans. 18 months ago, we were rescuing 500 meals per week from 8 restaurants, I told our team of 12 employees. In 5 years, we'll be rescuing 50,000 meals per day across 15 cities. But we'll still be guided by the same principle. Everyone deserves dignified access to nutritious food. The Hamilton Foundation grant didn't just fund our growth, it transformed how we thought about our mission. We weren't just feeding hungry people, we were building an economy where hunger couldn't exist. We weren't just rescuing wasted food. We were creating a more just and sustainable food system. That $1 million check, now framed and displayed in our headquarters, represents more than financial support. It represents the moment when a 7-year-old's shame about stealing candy bars became a national movement to ensure no child would ever face that choice again. The Hamilton Foundation grant transformed Hope Kitchen Network from a local startup into a national expansion project almost overnight. By January 2018, we had moved from my apartment into a 15,000 square foot warehouse facility, hired a leadership team of 12 people, and begun the complex process of replicating our Austin model in cities across the country. The national expansion map that now dominates one wall of our headquarters started as a whiteboard sketch during our first strategic planning retreat. David Park, who'd become our board chair after the foundation grant, helped us identify target cities based on population density, food waste patterns, existing hunger relief infrastructure, and local policy environments. Houston was our obvious first choice, close enough for oversight, large enough for significant impact, with restaurant and grocery partnerships we could potentially leverage from our Austin relationships. Dallas followed, then San Antonio, creating a Texas triangle that would serve as our proof of concept for true multi-city operations, but expansion proved more complicated than simply copying our Austin playbook. Each city had different regulations, different community needs, different restaurant cultures, and different hunger relief ecosystems. What worked seamlessly in Austin's collaborative nonprofit environment faced resistance in Dallas's more competitive landscape. The Houston launch nearly broke us. Despite months of preparation, our first week of operations was a disaster. Restaurant partners who'd committed to participation backed out at the last minute. Our new warehouse location turned out to be in a flood zone that insurance companies wouldn't cover. The local health department required additional permits we hadn't anticipated, delaying our launch by 6 weeks. Most critically, we'd hired a local operations manager who looked perfect on paper but didn't share our values around community employment. When I discovered he'd rejected 3 qualified candidates because they had criminal records, exactly the population our employment program was designed to serve, I knew we had a fundamental culture problem. "I don't think you understand the liability issues," he argued during the difficult conversation that ended his employment. "We can't just hire anyone off the street. This is a business, not a charity." That phrase, "this is a business, not a charity," revealed everything wrong with his approach. Hope Kitchen Network was absolutely a business, but one whose success was measured by lives changed, not just meals delivered. Our competitive advantage wasn't efficiency alone, it was our commitment to hiring from the communities we served. The Houston setback taught us that scaling required more than operational systems, it required cultural systems that could maintain our values across multiple locations. We developed intensive training programs for new managers, created mentorship partnerships between experienced and new sites, and established quarterly cross-city visits to share best practices and maintain connection. Phoenix became our first successful out-of-state expansion, thanks to lessons learned from Houston's difficulties. We spent 3 months building relationships before launching operations, hired locally with extensive cultural training, and overinvested in community partnerships that would provide foundation for long-term success. The media attention that accompanied our expansion was both blessing and curse. Food and Wine magazine featured us in their annual Game Changers issue. The Today Show filmed a segment about our employment program. Forbes included me in their 30 Under 30 Social Entrepreneurs list. The recognition brought credibility and funding opportunities, but also scrutiny and pressure. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know how quickly we could expand to their city. Mayors called requesting presentations. Other foundations offered grants contingent on aggressive growth timelines. The demand for our model far exceeded our capacity to deliver it responsibly. The pressure to grow fast nearly compromised our commitment to grow well. During one particularly intense board meeting, a new member suggested we license our model to existing food banks rather than building our own operations in each city. "You could scale to 50 cities in 2 years instead of 15 cities in 5 years, he argued. The suggestion made financial sense but violated our core principle: community members should control organizations that serve their communities. Licensing to existing nonprofits would create Hope Kitchen Network programs without Hope Kitchen Network values, potentially replicating the same paternalistic approaches we were trying to change. "We're not just scaling a food rescue model," I reminded the board. "We're scaling an economic empowerment model that happens to use food rescue as its vehicle. If we lose that distinction, we lose everything that makes this work effective." By the end of 2019, we were operating in 8 cities across 4 states, rescuing 15,000 meals daily and employing 147 people who'd previously experienced food insecurity. Each location adapted our model to local conditions while maintaining core commitments to community employment, dignified service, and systematic approach to food rescue. The expansion map that tracked our growth became a source of pride for staff and inspiration for funders. Each pin represented not just a new location, but a new community of partners, employees, and families whose lives were improving through our work. The visual representation of our impact was powerful during board presentations and foundation meetings, but the real measure of success wasn't geographic coverage, it was depth of impact in each community. In Austin, our original location, we'd gone from rescuing 500 meals weekly to 3,000 meals daily. Restaurant partnerships had grown from 8 to 47. Our employment program had helped 18 people transition from food assistance recipients to homeownership. The expansion process taught me that scaling social impact required the same analytical rigor as scaling any business, but with additional complexity around mission alignment, community engagement, and cultural preservation. We weren't just opening new locations. We were planting seeds for movements that would grow differently in each community while maintaining shared DNA. Most importantly, the national expansion validated something I'd believed since my college business plan: hunger isn't a resource problem, it's a distribution problem. America produces enough food to feed everyone, we just lack systems to get excess food from places of abundance to places of need. Hope Kitchen Network was proving that private sector efficiency could solve public sector challenges when guided by social justice values. The map showing our 15 operational cities represents more than organizational growth, it represents proof that a 7-year-old's hunger could become a national solution to ensure no other child would go to bed hungry in the wealthiest country in human history. Success in changing the world came with costs I hadn't anticipated. By 2020, Hope Kitchen Network was rescuing over 20,000 meals daily across 12 cities, but I was slowly losing myself in the process of saving others. The organization had grown beyond my wildest dreams, but my personal life was collapsing under the weight of constant travel, 18-hour workdays, and the emotional burden of carrying so many people's hopes. The wake-up call came through a hospital bracelet, not mine, but my mother's. The call came at 2 a.m. during a board retreat in Denver. Mom had collapsed at work, her blood sugar dangerously high from diabetes she'd been hiding for months. As I sat in the emergency room holding her hand, seeing how frail she'd become, I realized I'd been so focused on feeding the world that I'd stopped taking care of the person who'd sacrificed everything to make my success possible. Mija, she whispered, looking exhausted under the harsh hospital lights, you're working too hard. This is not the life I wanted for you when I sent you to college. Her diabetes was a direct result of the chronic stress and poor nutrition she'd endured during my childhood. Years of choosing between rent and groceries, of giving me her food portions, of working multiple jobs to keep us housed, her body was finally presenting the bill for sacrifices I'd been too young to fully understand. The guilt was overwhelming. I'd built an organization dedicated to ensuring families had access to nutritious food, but I'd failed to notice that my own mother was rationing insulin because she couldn't afford both her medication and her rent. The woman who'd taught me about hunger was still experiencing it while I traveled the country speaking about food security solutions. That hospital bracelet became a symbol of everything I'd lost while gaining the world's respect. I'd been so busy being the CEO who feeds 20,000 people daily that I'd forgotten how to be the daughter who needed to feed one person consistently, the person who mattered most. The isolation had been building for years. Dating was impossible. When every conversation started with, "So what do you do?" and led to either uncomfortable silences or people trying to use my connections for their own projects. Friends from college couldn't relate to my life anymore, and colleagues at work needed me to be their leader, not their friend seeking support. I'd tried therapy twice, but quit both times when therapists wanted to process my childhood trauma around food insecurity. I didn't want to be healed from my hunger, it was the source of my purpose. But I was beginning to understand that unprocessed pain, even when channeled into positive action, could still destroy you from the inside. The breaking point came during a partnership meeting with Whole Foods executives in their Austin headquarters. Mid-presentation, explaining our food rescue model that could redirect their waste to our distribution network, I suddenly couldn't catch my breath. The conference room began spinning, my chest tightened, and I found myself gripping the table to stay upright. "Ms. Martinez, are you all right?" the regional director asked, but his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. I excused myself, stumbled to the bathroom, and spent 20 minutes hyperventilating in a stall, wondering if this was what heart attacks felt like. The panic attack, my first but not my last, forced me to confront the reality that my body was rejecting the pace I'd been maintaining. Jessica, now our director of operations, found me in the parking lot afterward, sitting in my car trying to calm down. "Sarah, you're burning out," she said gently. "And if you collapse, everything we've built collapses with you. You need help." The conversation with Jessica led to the most difficult decision of my professional life, taking a 3-month sabbatical to focus on my health and my mother's care. The board was supportive but concerned. Media interviews had to be cancelled. Speaking engagements were rescheduled. For someone whose identity was completely wrapped up in being the person who solved hunger, stepping away felt like abandonment, but those 3 months in San Antonio, helping my mother manage her diabetes while attending therapy twice weekly, taught me lessons I couldn't learn from any business book. I learned that trauma doesn't disappear just because you transform it into purpose. I learned that my mother's pride about accepting help was something I'd inherited, making it difficult for me to delegate or accept support. I learned that the hypervigilance that had helped me survive childhood poverty was now preventing me from trusting others to share the load. Most importantly, I learned that sustainable impact required sustainable leadership. The movement I'd started needed me to be healthy, not heroic. It needed me to model the self-care and dignity I wanted for every family we served. Dr. Sarah Vega, my therapist, helped me understand that my reluctance to accept help wasn't just personal, it was political. "You've spent your entire life proving that people in poverty deserve assistance," she explained. "But you haven't given yourself permission to need assistance. You're still that 7-year-old trying to prove she's worthy of help." The realization was devastating and liberating. I'd built an organization based on the principle that everyone deserves support, but I'd exempted myself from that philosophy. I was still operating from the scarcity mindset that had kept my family from applying for food stamps, still trying to earn my worthiness through perfect performance. Returning to work after the sabbatical meant rebuilding my relationship with Hope Kitchen Network as its leader rather than its savior. I hired an executive coach, established boundaries around work hours, and started taking actual vacations where I didn't check email. I also moved my mother to Austin, where she could receive better healthcare while being closer to family. The organization not only survived my absence, it thrived, proving that we'd built systems strong enough to function without my constant oversight. The team had stepped up, made important decisions, and maintained our culture of excellence without needing my daily input. That hospital bracelet now sits on my desk as a reminder that taking care of myself isn't selfish, it's essential for taking care of everyone else. My mother's health crisis taught me that the most revolutionary thing I could do was model the self-worth and self-care I wanted every person experiencing hunger to embrace for themselves. The number appeared on our digital counter at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October 2021, 10,000. 10,000 meals rescued and distributed in a single day across our 15 operational cities. I watched the display tick over from 9,999 to 10,000 and felt something I hadn't experienced since that first scholarship letter. The profound satisfaction of an impossible dream becoming measurable reality. The digital meal counter had been installed in our Austin headquarters 3 years earlier, displaying real-time data from all our locations. Staff members would check it throughout the day like a stock ticker, celebrating as numbers climbed toward daily goals. But 10,000 daily meals had seemed impossibly ambitious when we were struggling to reach 1,000. That Thursday started like any other. Morning reports from our 15 cities showed typical pickup schedules. Grocery stores in Portland redirecting produce approaching expiration dates, restaurant chains in Dallas providing surplus prepared meals, catering companies in Atlanta donating from canceled events. Nothing suggested we were about to achieve the milestone that had guided our strategic planning for 4 years. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a last-minute partnership with a major airline catering company whose flight cancellations had left them with 2,800 prepared meals that would expire within hours. Our Phoenix team mobilized every available vehicle, recruited additional volunteers, and coordinated with food banks across the metropolitan area to distribute the windfall before it spoiled. As the Phoenix numbers uploaded to our central database, the counter climbed rapidly: 8,500, 9,200, 9,750. Each increment felt electric, and word spread through our headquarters that we were approaching the milestone. Staff members abandoned their usual work to gather around the display, counting upward together. When it hit 10,000, the entire office erupted in cheers. Jessica immediately called an all-hands meeting, and within minutes, we had video calls connecting all 15 locations for an impromptu celebration. Seeing the faces of our team members, many of whom had been recipients of our services before, Becoming employees, sharing this moment of triumph was overwhelming. Maria Santos, our Houston operations manager who'd started as a client when she was homeless with 2 children, spoke for everyone. 5 years ago, I was standing in line waiting for food. Today, I'm helping serve 10,000 families. This isn't just a number, this is proof that people can change their lives when given the opportunity. The milestone represented more than operational achievement, it vindicated the employment-focused model that skeptics had questioned from our early days. Of our 247 full-time employees, 189 had personal experience with food insecurity. They weren't just implementing our mission, they were living proof of its effectiveness. The media attention was immediate and overwhelming. Local news stations covered the milestone in all 15 cities. National outlets picked up the story of the organization that had grown from a college student's business plan to a major force in American food rescue. The Today Show invited me back for a follow-up segment, 5 years after their first feature, about our employment program, but the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. Mr. Rodriguez, now in his 70s and retired, sent a handwritten note. Sarah, I always knew that little girl who helped me sweep my store would grow up to sweep hunger out of America. 10,000 families fed in one day, your mother would be so proud. My mother was proud, though she expressed it in her characteristic understated way. Mija, that's a lot of families, she said when I called to share the news. But don't forget to eat dinner yourself tonight. Even in celebration, she was still mothering me, still reminding me to take care of myself. The milestone celebration included sharing impact stories that illustrated what 10,000 daily meals meant in human terms. Rosa Gutierrez, the single mother who'd spoken to the Hamilton Foundation during our grant evaluation, had completed nursing school and bought her first home. Her children, who'd once depended on our rescued meals, were now honor students volunteering. At our weekend distribution events, David Park, our board chair, put the achievement in broader perspective during the celebration speech. When Sarah first presented her business plan to us, 10,000 daily meals seemed like fantasy. Today, it's Tuesday. Tomorrow, our goal is 15,000. This organization has proven that American ingenuity, guided by moral purpose, can solve problems that government programs have struggled with for decades. The success attracted new challenges. Foundations that had previously rejected our proposals were suddenly interested in funding expansion. Cities that had been skeptical about our employment-focused model were requesting presentations about bringing Hope Kitchen Network to their communities. The demand for our services and our approach was growing faster than our capacity to deliver with quality. Most significantly, the 10,000 meal milestone positioned us to influence policy at the national level. Congressional staffers began reaching out for our perspective on federal food rescue legislation. The USDA invited our input on guidelines for food donation programs. We were transitioning from an organization that worked within existing systems to one that could help reshape those systems. That evening, after the celebrations and media interviews ended, I stayed late in the office, watching the meal counter continue climbing. 10,247, 10,389, 10,512. Each number represented a family who wouldn't go to bed hungry, a child who could focus on homework instead of survival, a parent who could plan for tomorrow instead of just surviving today. The counter never stopped. Even as our Austin office closed for the night, teams in California were still making deliveries, pushing the daily total higher. Food rescue had become a 24-hour operation spanning multiple time zones, a network of dedicated people ensuring that good food reached hungry families rather than landfills. I thought about the 7-year-old who'd stolen candy bars, about the college student who'd written a coffee-stained business plan, about the young professional who'd quit her corporate job to chase an impossible dream. Each version of myself had contributed to this moment, but none could have imagined its magnitude. The digital display now permanently shows 10,000, frozen at that milestone moment as both achievement marker and inspiration for future growth. It reminds everyone who enters our headquarters that impossible goals become inevitable outcomes when enough people commit to making them reality. 10,000 meals in a single day proved that hunger isn't an unchangeable fact of American life, it's a solvable problem that yields to persistent, strategic, compassionate action. The number represents hope quantified, dignity distributed, and the radical proposition that everyone deserves access to nutritious food regardless of their economic circumstances. The address was seared into my memory, 1247 Maple Street, the cramped 2-bedroom apartment where my mother and I had survived those hungry years. Driving through my old neighborhood in early 2022 to scout locations for our newest distribution center, I was amazed by how small everything looked. The streets that had seemed endless when I walked them as a child were just a few blocks long. The apartment complex that had housed our desperation was just one of dozens of identical buildings, but the poverty was the same. The same tired parents carrying grocery bags from the corner store, paying too much for too little. The same children walking to school with that hollow look I recognized in my own childhood photos. The same elderly residents sitting on stoops, watching the world go by because they had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. When I announced our plans to open Hope Kitchen Network's largest operation in East Austin, the neighborhood where I'd grown up stealing candy bars, the decision wasn't entirely practical. We could have chosen more efficient locations with better highway access and lower rent. But returning to my roots felt like completing a circle that had been 25 years in the making. The community meeting to introduce our plans was held at the same elementary school I'd attended, in the same cafeteria where I'd pretended not to be hungry. About 50 residents showed up, many of them skeptical about another organization promising to help their community. They'd heard promises before from politicians, nonprofits, and developers who'd ultimately gentrified them out of their homes. "Why should we trust you?" asked Mrs. Patterson, not my old teacher, but a woman about the same age with the same no-nonsense attitude. "You got out of this neighborhood and made it big. Now you want to come back and feel good about helping the people you left behind?" Her question cut deep because it contained truth I'd been avoiding. I had left this community behind, in many ways. My success had been individual rather than collective, an escape rather than an elevation of everyone around me. The guilt I'd carried about leaving my mother alone had expanded to include leaving my entire community behind. "You're right to be skeptical," I admitted to the room. "I did leave this neighborhood, and I did make it big. But I never forgot being hungry here. I never forgot the kindness of people like Mr. Rodriguez, who helped my family when we couldn't help ourselves. This isn't about charity, it's about building an economy where hunger can't exist." I told them about our employment model, about hiring from the communities we served, about creating pathways out of poverty rather than just managing its symptoms. I shared statistics about our other locations, how many people had moved from food assistance to homeownership, how many children in our partner communities were graduating high school at higher rates, how many families had achieved financial stability. But what really connected with the audience was when I brought out a faded photograph from my purse, a picture of 7-year-old me standing in front of 1247 Maple Street, all knobby knees and hand-me-down clothes, trying to smile despite everything we were facing. "This is me, in this neighborhood, 25 years ago," I said, holding up the photo. That little girl had no idea she'd grow up to run an organization that feeds thousands of families daily. She just knew she was hungry, and she needed help. If we can create opportunities for kids who look like this today, imagine what they might accomplish in 25 years. The room's energy shifted. Questions changed from skeptical challenges to practical concerns about implementation. How many jobs would we create? What were the hiring requirements? Would people with criminal records be eligible? Could parents work schedules that accommodated school pickup times? The planning process took 8 months, but it was the most community-driven expansion we'd ever undertaken. Instead of imposing our model on the neighborhood, we adapted it based on resident input. The facility would include a commercial kitchen for food preparation training, a community garden for fresh produce, and meeting spaces available for neighborhood organizations. Opening day felt like a homecoming and a healing all at once. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was attended by hundreds of community members, along with city officials, foundation partners, and media representatives. But the guest who mattered most was Mr. Rodriguez, now 78 years old and using a walker but determined to be present for this moment. "Sarah always had the heart to help people," he told the crowd, his voice still carrying that familiar accent that had comforted me decades earlier. "But now she has the power to help people too. This is what America is supposed to be, people lifting each other up." When my mother cut the ribbon, her hand steadier now thanks to better diabetes management and reduced stress, I thought about the impossible journey from that cramped apartment to this moment. The scared single mother who'd been too proud to apply for food stamps was now inaugurating a facility that would serve 2,000 families daily without requiring anyone to surrender their dignity. The facility tour revealed innovations we'd never implemented before, all suggested by community members during the planning process. A community choice section where families could select their own groceries rather than receiving pre-packed bags. A commercial kitchen offering food service training that led directly to employment opportunities. A homework help center where children could focus on education while their parents accessed services. But the most powerful moment came when I walked through the distribution area and saw families I'd grown up with, neighbors who remembered the little girl who'd helped Mr. Rodriguez sweep his store, parents who'd watched me graduate high school as the first in my family to achieve that milestone. They weren't just clients of our services. They were part of our community's evolution. Mrs. Garcia, who'd lived next door during my childhood, approached me during the open house. "I remember when your mama was so worried about you," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She used to ask all the neighbors to pray that you'd have opportunities she couldn't give you. Look what those prayers became." The photograph of my 7-year-old self now hangs in the East Austin facility's lobby, alongside current photos of children participating in our programs. The then and now comparison shows what's possible when communities invest in their most vulnerable members, when individual success becomes collective empowerment. That evening, as families explored their new resource center and children played in the safe outdoor space we'd created, I realized this facility represented more than expanded services. It was proof that leaving home to gain power could lead to returning home to share power. The little girl who'd stolen candy bars had grown up to build a system where no child would need to make that choice again. The East Austin location serves as our largest single facility, but more importantly, it serves as a model for community-driven development that other neighborhoods can adapt for their own needs. We didn't just bring Hope Kitchen Network to my childhood community, we created a template for communities everywhere to build their own solutions to hunger and poverty. The invitation to testify before Congress arrived on a Monday morning in March 2023, addressed to Ms. Sarah Martinez, Chief Executive Officer, Hope Kitchen Network. The House Subcommittee on Nutrition, Oversight, and Department Operations was holding hearings on federal food waste reduction and hunger relief programs, and they wanted my perspective on how private sector innovations could complement government initiatives. Sitting in my office, reading the formal invitation on official letterhead, I thought about the journey from 7-year-old candy bar thief to someone whose opinion mattered to federal lawmakers. The transformation felt surreal, but the responsibility felt urgent. This wasn't just about Hope Kitchen Network anymore, it was about influencing policies that could affect millions of Americans experiencing food insecurity. The preparation process was intensive. Congressional testimony requires more than good intentions and compelling stories, it demands data, specific policy recommendations, and the ability to answer detailed questions about implementation and cost. I spent weeks working with our research team to compile evidence about food rescue's effectiveness, economic impact, and scalability potential. My handwritten notes from that preparation, now framed in my office, capture the key messages I wanted to convey. Federal policy should incentivize food rescue through tax benefits for donors, liability protection for good faith donations, and funding for organizations that combine hunger relief with employment creation. Simple concepts, but ones that could transform how America approaches food waste and food security. The hearing room in the Rayburn House office building was imposing, high ceilings, formal podiums, cameras documenting every word for public record. But as I sat at the witness table, waiting for questioning to begin, I thought about all the people whose stories had brought me to this moment. Mr. Rodriguez, my mother, Antonio, the hundreds of employees who'd transformed their lives through our organization. Ranking Member Williams opened with the question I'd anticipated, Ms. Martinez. Critics argue that private food rescue organizations like yours simply enable businesses to continue wasteful practices while avoiding responsibility for systemic change. How do you respond to that concern? Congressman Williams, I appreciate that question because it gets to the heart of why we need both policy change and private innovation. I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. Hope Kitchen Network doesn't enable waste, we measure and reduce it. Our partner restaurants have decreased food waste by an average of 35% since joining our network, because our data helps them optimize ordering and preparation. The questioning continued for 2 hours, covering everything from food safety regulations to the economic impact of employment programs. Representative Chen asked about scalability. If we provided federal funding, could your model expand to serve every major metropolitan area in America? Representative Chen, the answer is yes, but only if we maintain our community employment focus, I replied. Sustainable food rescue requires people who understand hunger personally. Our success comes from hiring from the communities we serve, creating economic mobility alongside food access. The most challenging question came from Representative Martinez, no relation, despite the shared surname, who questioned whether private organizations could match the scale and consistency of government programs. Ms. Martinez, isn't it unrealistic to expect nonprofit organizations to solve problems that federal agencies struggle to address? The question touched on fundamental debates about public versus private sector effectiveness, but I tried to reframe it around collaboration rather than competition. Representative Martinez, this isn't about replacing government programs, it's about creating partnerships that leverage both sectors' strengths. Government provides stability and scale, private organizations provide innovation and efficiency. Together, we can accomplish what neither could achieve alone. During the lunch break, I walked the halls of Congress thinking about how surreal this experience would have seemed to my younger self. The hungry child who'd hidden from free lunch programs was now advising legislators about hunger policy. The college student with the coffee-stained business plan was being consulted on federal budget allocations, but the real impact of congressional testimony isn't the hearing itself, it's the conversations that follow. Over the next 6 months, staffers from multiple offices reached out for detailed briefings about our model. The USDA invited us to participate in working groups developing new food donation guidelines. The Department of Labor expressed interest in our employment programs as models for workforce development initiatives. Most significantly, the hearing led to inclusion of the Food Recovery and Employment Act in the following year's Farm Bill. The legislation provided tax incentives for food donors, liability protections for rescue organizations, and federal funding for programs that combined hunger relief with job creation. While the final bill didn't include everything we'd recommended, it represented meaningful policy progress toward treating food rescue as economic development rather than just charity. The international attention that followed was unexpected but transformative. Delegations from Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia visited our operations to study models they could adapt for their own countries. The European Union invited me to present at their Sustainable Development Conference. What had started as a local solution to Austin's food waste was being studied as a potential template for addressing global hunger. The policy advocacy work required new skills and new partnerships. We joined coalitions with other food rescue organizations, environmental groups focused on waste reduction, and anti-poverty advocates pushing for systemic change. Learning to navigate political processes while maintaining our nonpartisan focus challenged me to think strategically about power and influence. But the most meaningful validation came from families whose lives had changed through our programs. During one of my DC visits, I received a video message from Rosa Gutierrez, the single mother who'd spoken to the Hamilton Foundation years earlier. She was now a registered nurse working at a children's hospital, her sons were both honor students, and she'd just purchased her second home as an investment property. "Sarah, I'm watching you on C-SPAN testifying before Congress," she said in the video, tears streaming down her face. 5 years ago, I was standing in line for rescued food. Today, you're changing laws so other families won't need to stand in those lines. This is what transformation looks like. Those handwritten notes from my congressional testimony preparation represent more than policy recommendations, they represent the evolution from personal survival to systemic change. The 7-year-old who stole candy bars had grown into an adult who could influence the laws and policies that shaped whether other children would face similar choices. The bigger picture I was learning to see extended far beyond Hope Kitchen Network's direct services. We were part of a larger movement toward economic justice, environmental sustainability, and social innovation that could reshape how America thinks about poverty, waste, and opportunity. The hunger that had once defined my childhood was becoming the foundation for policies that could prevent other children from experiencing the same pain. March 2020 brought chaos that no business plan could have anticipated. The COVID-19 pandemic transformed Hope Kitchen Network from a well-oiled machine serving 12,000 daily meals across 15 cities into an emergency response organization scrambling to meet unprecedented demand while protecting staff and volunteers from an invisible threat. The first indication of what was coming arrived through frantic calls from restaurant partners on Thursday, March 12. "Sarah, we're closing dining rooms indefinitely," reported Antonio, whose original partnership had launched our entire operation. "But we still have all this food. Can you handle triple the usual volume?" Simultaneously, our community partners were reporting dramatic increases in families seeking assistance. People who'd never experienced food insecurity were suddenly unemployed. Parents who'd previously relied on school breakfast and lunch programs found themselves responsible for feeding children 3 meals daily. Elderly residents who depended on senior center meals were isolated at home with no access to nutrition support. Within 48 hours, our demand had increased by 400% while our volunteer workforce disappeared. College students returned home to their families. Retirees who'd been our most reliable volunteers were sheltering in place. Working parents couldn't leave their children to volunteer. The community members we employed were essential workers. But many were terrified of exposure risks. The emergency operations plan we developed in those first chaotic weeks became our roadmap for pandemic response. Working 18-hour days from my kitchen table, coordinating with team leaders across 15 cities via endless video calls, we completely reimagined how food rescue could function during a public health crisis. Safety protocols were our first priority. Every employee received personal protective equipment. All food handling procedures were revised to exceed CDC guidelines. Vehicles were sanitized between routes. distribution became contactless, with families remaining in their cars, while staff loaded groceries into trunks, but the most significant adaptation was transitioning from prepared meal distribution to grocery provision. Restaurant partners were closed, but grocery stores were drowning in supply chain disruptions, perfect produce rejected for aesthetic imperfections, dairy products approaching expiration dates, packaged goods with torn labels that couldn't be sold at full price. The pivot required completely new logistics. Instead of delivering hot meals to community centers, we were packaging groceries for home preparation. Instead of serving 50 families at a single location, we were distributing to 200 families through drive-through operations. Instead of relying on volunteers for sorting and packing, we hired additional staff to handle increased volume safely. Our smallest operation in Portland became our testing ground for pandemic innovations. Within 2 weeks, they developed a system that tripled their capacity while reducing volunteer requirements by 80%. Families registered online for specific pickup times, received text messages with instructions, and completed their entire transaction without human contact. The success in Portland became the template for all our locations. By May, we were serving 45,000 families daily, nearly 4 times our pre-pandemic volume, with better efficiency and safety protocols than we'd achieved before the crisis. The forced innovation had made us a stronger organization, but the emotional toll was overwhelming. Staff members were working extreme hours while worried about their own family's health and security. Many of our employees lived in multi-generational households where elderly relatives were at high risk. The fear was constant and justified. Several team members contracted COVID despite precautions, and we lost one volunteer to the virus. The financial stress was equally intense. Foundation funding that had been pledged for expansion projects was redirected to emergency relief. Corporate partnerships were suspended as businesses focused on survival. We burned through reserves at an unsustainable rate while wondering how long we could maintain emergency operations. The breakthrough came through federal emergency funding programs designed to support nonprofit organizations during the pandemic. The Paycheck Protection Program provided crucial breathing room for staff salaries. Emergency food and shelter program grants helped cover operational costs. Most importantly, the CARES Act included provisions that made food rescue organizations eligible for disaster relief funding for the first time. Navigating federal bureaucracy during a national emergency required skills I'd never needed as a food rescue CEO. Applications had to be submitted within impossible timeframes. Documentation requirements were extensive and constantly changing. But the funding we received, over $3.2 million across all our locations, allowed us to maintain operations while expanding services. The most unexpected outcome was how pandemic response accelerated our policy advocacy goals. Suddenly, food rescue was recognized as essential infrastructure rather than nice-to-have charity. The same legislators who'd been politely skeptical during my congressional testimony were calling to ask how quickly we could expand to their districts. By the end of 2020, Hope Kitchen Network had served over 16 million meals, more than double our previous annual total. We'd hired 89 additional staff members, most of them community members who'd lost jobs due to pandemic closures. We'd developed technology platforms that made our operations more efficient than ever before, but the real measure of success wasn't organizational growth, it was community resilience. Families who'd received our services during the crisis's peak were writing thank you notes describing how consistent food access had allowed them to focus on remote schooling, job searching, and caring for sick relatives. The emergency response had prevented a hunger crisis from becoming a hunger catastrophe. The pandemic pivot plan, documented in hastily written procedures and constantly updated spreadsheets, represents more than operational adaptation. It demonstrates how organizations built on strong values and community relationships can respond to unprecedented challenges while maintaining their core mission. Those emergency documents now serve as templates for disaster response that we've shared with food rescue organizations internationally. What started as crisis management became innovation that improved our effectiveness permanently. The pandemic forced us to become more efficient, more technology-enabled, and more responsive to community needs than we'd ever been during normal operations. Most importantly, the pandemic proved that hunger isn't inevitable, it's a policy choice. When government resources were mobilized quickly and comprehensively, food insecurity decreased even during massive economic disruption. The crisis demonstrated what was possible when political will match the scale of the problem, providing a roadmap for post-pandemic policy advocacy. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 2024, addressed in the careful handwriting of a 7-year-old. Dear Ms. Sarah, it began, thank you for the food. My mom said you used to be hungry like me but now you help hungry kids. I want to help hungry kids too when I grow up. Love, Emma. Attached was a drawing in bright crayons, a little girl with pigtails handing a sandwich to another little girl, both of them smiling under a yellow sun, sitting in my office, holding that precious letter. I was transported back 25 years. To another little girl who'd been hungry and ashamed, who'd stolen candy bars and dreamed of a world where no child would face the same choice. Emma's words completed a circle I'd been drawing my entire adult life, connecting my past pain to someone else's future possibility. The drawing now hangs next to my desk, alongside the coffee-stained business plan, the $1 million grant check, and the congressional testimony notes. But Emma's artwork holds a special place because it represents the ultimate measure of our success, inspiring the next generation to continue the work of building a more just world. By fall 2024, Hope Kitchen Network was serving over 47,000 meals daily across 23 cities and 12 states. We'd redirected 78 million pounds of food from waste streams to family tables. Our employment program had helped 1,247 people transition from food assistance recipients to homeownership. The 7-year-old who'd once stolen to eat had built an organization that proved hunger was a solvable problem, not an unchangeable fact, but the numbers, however impressive, couldn't capture what mattered most: the transformation of shame into purpose, individual survival into collective empowerment, personal pain into systemic change. Every meal served carried the DNA of that hungry child's determination to ensure no other child would face the same desperation. The final chapter of this story began earlier that year, when my mother was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. The woman who'd sacrificed everything to give me opportunities was slowly losing her memories, but her pride in my accomplishments remained crystal clear. During one of our last meaningful conversations, she looked at me with the same fierce love that had sustained us through those hungry years. "Mija, you did what I always dreamed you'd do," she said, her voice soft but certain. "You took our pain and turned it into other people's hope. That's the most beautiful thing a person can do with their life." Her words became my final validation, not from foundations or government officials or media outlets, but from the person who'd loved me through hunger and taught me that dignity mattered more than comfort, that pride could coexist with need. That temporary shame didn't define permanent worth. The funeral was held at the same church where we'd occasionally sought help during our hardest times, attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her daughter's work. Mr. Rodriguez, now 82 and frail but determined to pay his respects, spoke about the scared little girl he'd caught stealing who'd grown up to feed the world. "Her mama raised a daughter who remembered where she came from," he said, his voice carrying across the crowded sanctuary. "Sarah never forgot what it felt like to be hungry, so she made sure other people wouldn't have to feel that way. That's the gift good parents give the world, children who use their success to lift others up." Processing my grief while continuing to lead an organization serving nearly 50,000 people daily required the same survival skills I'd learned during childhood: the ability to function despite pain, to find purpose in difficulty, to transform personal struggle into public service. But now I had resources my younger self never could have imagined: a team of dedicated colleagues, a network of supportive partners, and the knowledge that my work was creating lasting change. The most profound comfort came from letters like Emma's, arriving weekly from children and families whose lives had been stabilized by consistent access to nutritious food. Parents writing about children who could focus on homework instead of hunger. Students graduating high school because breakfast programs had supported their academic success. Elderly residents maintaining independence because meal delivery services had kept them nourished and connected. Each letter confirmed that the cycle of hunger and shame that had defined my childhood was being broken for thousands of other families. The little girl who'd hidden her poverty was raising a generation that didn't have to hide their need, that could access help with dignity, that could dream about their futures instead of just surviving their present. Looking ahead, I see challenges that would have overwhelmed my younger self but now feel like opportunities for innovation. Climate change is disrupting food production and distribution systems worldwide. Economic inequality is creating new forms of food insecurity even in affluent communities. Political polarization threatens funding for social programs that millions of families depend on, but I also see reasons for hope that my childhood hunger couldn't have imagined. Technology platforms that can predict food waste and redirect it in real time. Employment programs that create pathways from poverty to prosperity. Policy frameworks that treat hunger as a symptom of systemic inequality rather than individual failure. Most importantly, I see young people like Emma, who are growing up in a world where hunger exists but isn't accepted as inevitable, where solutions are being tested and scaled, where the next generation is being taught that everyone deserves access to nutritious food regardless of their economic circumstances. The work continues, but the shame is gone. The hunger that once defined my childhood has become the foundation for thousands of families' food security. The pain that felt so isolating and permanent has been transformed into connection and hope. Tomorrow, Hope Kitchen Network will serve another 47,000 meals. Children like Emma will receive nutritious food that supports their growth and learning. Parents will have one less worry as they navigate economic challenges. Elderly residents will maintain their independence with support that preserves their dignity, and somewhere, a 7-year-old facing the same choices I faced 25 years ago will discover that help is available, that shame isn't necessary. That hunger is temporary but hope can be permanent, that 7-year-old won't have to steal candy bars to survive, because another 7-year-old grew up and built a world where no child would face that choice. The circle is complete, but the work continues, carried forward by everyone who believes that America's promise of opportunity should include the basic promise of enough food to sustain life and nurture dreams. Emma's letter reminds me that the most important legacy isn't the organization I built or the meals we served or the policies we influenced. It's the proof that one person's pain, transformed by love and guided by justice, can become the foundation for countless others' possibility. The hungry child becomes the fed adult who ensures other children won't go hungry. The cycle breaks. The circle closes, and hope multiplies across generations.